In 1854, in the sweltering heart of St. John the Baptist Parish, where Louisiana's air hung heavy with humidity and sorrow, and the unspoken weight of all the lives trapped beneath the boots of 7 merciless masters, I lived as a candle maker, a mother, and a woman whose soul had long learned to fold itself small enough to avoid being crushed until the morning they brought my son back to me broken. My name is Ek, though for most of my life it was said only in passing, barely acknowledged, as if spoken to loudly it might remind the world that I was human, that I breathed and feared and hoped the way all people do. But before the parish learned to whisper my name in dread, before the masters felt the breath of spirits they could neither command nor comprehend, before flames and vengeance rewrote the stories carved into these plantations, I was simply a mother trying to survive one more day. And my Baptist was the one bright thread woven through the fabric of a life otherwise stitched with grief. He was 9 years old, born with a smile so quick and curious it could soften the cracked edges of the world. His laughter carried through the cane fields, the way bird song carried through the cypress trees at dawn, light and fleeting and precious. He loved to fish before sunrise, claiming the bayou looked different before the world fully woke, as if the water remembered a time before chains. That morning he carried his small fishing line the way he always did, wrapped around fingers that still bore the softness of childhood. And by noon, those same fingers were stiff and cold when they threw his body at my feet. They said he had smiled at Amelia Thornton. A smile, that was all. A harmless, innocent smile from a boy who still believed the world might someday be gentle. But in a parish where skin decided fate, a smile could become a crime, a breath could become defiance, and a child could become a threat. Amelia, 16, pale as magnolia petals and twice as fragile in her own mind, screamed as if Baptist had wounded her. Her friends echoed the cry, their voices rising not in fear but in performance. Each lie they layered onto the story clothed in the authority their whiteness provided, and that was enough. Enough for Master Thornton, the man who owned my labor, my breath, and according to the law, even my right to grieve, to drag my boy into the swamp with Pike, an overseer whose cruelty seemed to bubble beneath his skin like tar. They took Baptist where the water swallowed sound and the cypress roots tangled, like the fingers of the dead reaching upward. They beat him until his cries turned thin and then silent. And then they carried him back, limp and ruined, and hurled him at my feet like waste. His head struck the dirt with a soft thud, the kind that does not belong to the living, and every bone in my body knew, before I touched him, that the world had shifted permanently, violently. Thornton stared at me with the coldness of a man who believed himself untouchable and said, "Let this be a lesson about knowing your place." But when I looked into Baptist's lifeless face, when I held the weight that had once been warm with promise and mischief, I understood that the only lesson learned that morning was mine, the lesson that monsters bleed, that gods listen, and that fear is a currency even the powerful must one day repay. I buried my boy in the slave cemetery behind the plantation, the ground crowded with graves, no one marked, no one recorded, no one honored. The earth there was thick with grief, fertile with bones and memories the world pretended not to see. I dug until my fingers blistered, until the blisters tore and bled, until the dirt beneath my nails mixed with the blood that grief had coaxed from my skin. 3 women from the quarters stood behind me silently, the shadows long under the evening sun, offering presents when words were useless. But I did not bury all of him. I cut a lock of his hair. I took the dirt from his grave and held it as though it still carried the sound of his laughter. I gathered every tear that fell that night into a small bottle, remembering my grandmother's hands guiding mine decades ago, teaching me how to hold sorrow carefully, how to preserve pain until the moment it became power. My grandmother Marie had come from Haiti with the old ways braided into her hair, with prayer stitched into her tongue, with knowledge the plantation owners feared because they could not possess it. She raised me with the languages of the lower, humming beneath her breath. She taught me that healing was sacred, that protection was a duty, and that some doors should never be opened unless one was prepared to pay whatever price demanded. For 15 years after her death, I honored her teachings, using the old ways only to heal, to soothe, to shield those who sought refuge from pain. But the morning Baptist died, something inside me shifted, cracked open, woke up. Rage and grief fused into something sharper than iron, heavier than stone. And I knew as surely as I knew my own heartbeat that the old ways had another path carved into their shadows, one I had never dared approach. Until then, 7 masters ruled the parish like gods carved from cruelty. Thornton, who murdered my son. Beaumont, who measured human value in pounds of sugar produced. Devo, who trafficked children as though they were livestock. Martian, who beat women with a collector's pleasure. Rousseau, who starved his slaves with deliberate malice. Fontaine, who used our bodies in experiments that left more corpses than cures. And Lavigny, the richest and cruelest of them all, the one other masters whispered about when the lamps burned low and fear softened their pride. 7 men, 7 sources of suffering, 7 torches burning through the lives of everyone trapped beneath their boots. I decided there would be 7 candles. I was a candle maker. Wax and flame had been my companions since childhood. But wax is more than wax, flame is more than flame, and intention, when sharpened by loss, becomes something the world should tremble before. I began gathering what I needed. Herbs that bloomed only at the edge of night, seeds that whispered of poison, graveyard dirt stolen from those who had died violently, items touched by each master. Celeste, whose brother Beaumont had beaten to death, brought me drops of his blood. Joseph, who worked in Devo's stables, stole strands of his hair. Marie, trembling but resolute, tore a scrap from Martian's discarded shirt. Others followed small offerings left in my cabin, tokens of quiet rebellion, each one a thread in a tapestry of vengeance woven from desperation and hope. At night, when the rest of the quarters slept, I lit a single candle and called the names of the lower. The air shifted, shadows curled, the boundary between worlds thinned like breath on glass. Baron Samedi arrived first, carrying the scent of earth freshly turned. The promise of graves opened and justice awakened. Ogun came next, iron and fire in his presence, recognizing the sharpness of my fury. Azuli wept with me, mother to all grieving mothers. Morinette's voice crackled like a burning forest, fierce and hungry. Guy laughed with a joy that bordered on madness, tasting the death that would come. Damballa glided like a serpent through the dark, ancient and watchful. And Papa Legba, keeper of crossroads, stood between all worlds and asked if I understood what I was choosing. I told him I did. I told him I would pay. One by one they agreed. One by one they asked for offerings, my tears, my blood, my memories, my promise. And I gave all of it freely. I crafted the 7 candles in silence, mixing wax with death and tears and rage until each candle pulsed with a purpose all its own. They were not tools, they were sentences, they were truths the masters had spent lifetimes avoiding. And when the first new moon rose dark, silent, unwavering, I placed the black candle for Master Thornton on my small altar, surrounded it with rum, cigars, gravé dirt, and the lock of Baptist's hair. And as the flame sparked to life, I felt the world shift. I felt the spirits lean close. I felt the truth settle into my bones. 7 men would die, and my son would be avenged. When the new moon settled over the parish like a lid shutting out the last traces of mercy, I lit the first candle, the one moulded from black wax infused with gravé dirt, Baptist's hair, oleander petals, and the tears I had saved on the night grief nearly drowned me. And as the flame climbed upward, small, yet certain, I whispered the prayers my grandmother had etched into my bones, prayers in Creole and ancient tongues that curled through the air like smoke searching for the years of spirits. The cabin was dark except for that single flickering light, the shadows trembling, if they sensed what was coming. I could feel the lower gather Baron Samedi's cold amusement brushing the back of my neck, Ogun's iron heat warming my chest, Ursuli's grieving sighs settling over my shoulders like a shawl soaked in sorrow. And then something deeper, older, a shift in the air, a tightening in the world itself, and I knew the balance had tipped. I whispered Master Thornton's name, spoke his crimes, spoke the reasons his breath no longer belonged to him. The flame flickered once, twice, then flared blue at its heart, a color no earthly wick could make. I felt the ground beneath me hum. When morning came, I did not seek news. I continued making candles, as if nothing inside me had changed. But 3 days later, the plantation erupted with frantic footsteps, shrieks, and whispers that spun like locusts through the air. Master Thornton had been found dead in his study, slumped over his desk, his face distorted into a rictus of terror, so sharp it seemed carved from stone. His eyes were wide, still staring at something no mortal could see. The doctor said heart attack. The slaves said Baron Samedi had come to collect. I said nothing, but inside me something small and cold unfolded, a satisfaction so deep it felt like breathing for the first time after drowning. The day of his burial, white folks walked with stiff shoulders and darting eyes, and for the first time I saw fear in them, not of the slaves, but of something else, something no whip or law could control. A month passed, each day thick with tension, as whispers slithered from one plantation to another. The masters were meeting more often, drinking more heavily, sleeping less. Their eyes darted toward shadows as if the darkness itself had grown teeth. I waited for the next new moon, letting fear take root in their minds, the way rot takes root in wood, quiet at first, then unstoppable. The second candle, red as fresh blood and mixed with rust scraped from the chains Beaumont had used on his slaves, thorns from the cane fields, and drops of Beaumont's blood stolen by Celeste, sat waiting. On the night of the new moon, I lit it with the same steady hand, calling on Ogun to turn Beaumont's cruelty back onto him. The flame roared higher than the first candles had, hungry, impatient. 5 days later, screams tore through the plantation. Master Beaumont had fallen into the giant sugar mill gears, the same machinery that had chewed through slave limbs and lives for years. They said it was an accident. They said his foot slipped. They said it happened too fast to save him. But the slaves knew, and deep down Beaumont's family knew too. Though they never spoke it, the mill had claimed him with the same mercilessness he had inflicted upon others. Another new moon rose, dark and heavy. This time the candle was white, streaked with herbs of madness and the broken toys of sold children, infused with the tears of mothers who whispered vengeance through clenched teeth. It was for Master Devo, the man who looked at children the way merchants looked at livestock. I called on Azuli, the mother of sorrow, to show him every child he had stolen. The flame danced quietly at first, almost tender, before twisting into something sharp. Within a week, Master Devo's mind began to unravel. He screamed at night, claiming children crawled through the shadows and tugged at his clothes. He swore he heard their cries in the walls, felt their breath on his neck, woke gasping from nightmares that spilled into daylight. His wife begged the doctor to help him, but no medicine could heal a wound carved by spirits. 2 weeks later, he died, thin as a starving animal, eyes glazed with terror, 3 masters fallen. The parish began to tremble, and I, who had been invisible my whole life, moved through the world like smoke there, and then gone, never noticed long enough to be suspected. The 4th candle was purple, the color of bruised skin, mixed with blood from Martian's victims, shards of shattered bottles, and Nightshade's poisonous kiss. This was the candle that frightened me the most, not because of what I asked Marinette to do, but because of how readily she seemed to answer. On the night of the new moon, when I lit the candle, the flame did not flicker. It stood tall, still, waiting. 3 nights later, Martian was found dead in his bed. Though bed was too gentle a word for the state they found him in, his bones were shattered, his internal organs ruptured, his face twisted in agony so profound it seemed he had died screaming 4 hours. Yet on the outside, his skin had barely a bruise. Women in the quarters lit small candles at night, not in mourning, but in thanks. The 5th candle waited, green and mold-speckled, created from the spoiled bread Master Rousseau fed his slaves, and dirt from fields where crops had failed under bodies too weak to work. I called on Gide to turn hunger back upon him. Almost immediately, after the candle burned down, Rousseau began vomiting everything he ate. His body rejected all nourishment, even water rebelled. Surrounded by food, he starved over 3 agonizing weeks, shrinking into a husk of a man who begged the gods for mercy he had never given. And then came the 6th candle, blue as poison and cold as regret. This candle held ashes from slaves Fontaine had experimented on, mercury and arsenic stolen from his medical stores, and pages from the journals where he wrote the suffering of others with clinical detachment. I called on Damballa, the serpent lower, to let his own poisons coil back around him. Fontaine fell ill within days. His symptoms mirrored those he had inflicted upon the enslaved bodies he used as instruments. His organs failed in the same sequence he once documented. His breath grew ragged, his screams echoed through the big house, and his final words, according to his servants, were apologies whispered too late. 6 masters dead in 6 months. The parish had become a living wound. White families whispered prayers at their doors. Overseers flinched at every rustle of wind. Voodoo, a word they once spat with contempt, now clung to their throats like a curse too heavy to swallow. Only Master Lavini remained the oldest tyrant, the richest, the one whose cruelty had no boundaries. And he felt death creeping closer every day. He barricaded himself in his house, amulets dangling from his neck in such abundance he could barely move. Priests blessed his hallways. Voodoo practitioners, frauds, sold him cheap charms. Guards patrolled day and night, though even they trembled as if the shadows themselves hunted them. And while the white folks quivered beneath fear, a different kind of whisper moved you through the slave quarters' hope. Quiet, cautious, but growing, conductors from the Underground Railroad slipped messages between plantations. Routes were mapped, supplies were hidden. 400 enslaved souls prepared to flee the moment Lavini fell. All that remained was the 7th candle, the most dangerous creation my hands had ever shaped, a candle swirled with all colors, infused with all 6 previous curses and strengthened with my own blood. It pulsed like a living thing, eager for the moment it would be born into flame. And as the night of the 7th new moon approached, I felt the world tilt, as if all of creation was holding its breath. On the night of the 7th new moon, when the sky above St. John the Baptist parish was a black bowl with no stars, and the air pressed down so thick it felt like breathing through wet cloth, I knew the world was about to tilt in a way that could never be undone. And I moved through my small cabin with the steadiness of someone who has already paid for what she is about to do. The 7th candle sat at the center of my altar, a swirl of colors drawn from all the others: black, red, white, purple, green, blue, each hue layered with the echoes of the deaths it had already helped unleash. I had poured into it not only the remains of the previous 6 candles, but my own blood, pricked from my finger and dripped into the melted wax, binding my life directly to the curse I was about to call down. Around it I placed offerings for Papa Legba, candies and toys, because he is sometimes a child, rum and cigars, because he is also an old man, coins because he stands at the crossroads where all bargains are made. I circled those with the stubs and waxy fragments of the 6 candles that had already burned, each a little tombstone of a master who had once believed himself untouchable. The cabin was so silent as I could hear my own heartbeat, slow and heavy, each thud echoing with years of enslaved breath. Outside, the swamp sang in its usual chorus of frogs and insects, but as I began the prayers, as I traced Papa Legba's veve with cornmeal on the floor, as I called his name with all the reverence and need a human soul can carry, the sound faded until it felt like the entire parish was holding its breath. I told him who I was. I told him what I had done. I told him why I had done it. I told him about Baptiste, about a 9-year-old boy who had smiled at the wrong girl and died for it, about mothers whose arms had been torn empty, about men worked to death in fields they would never own, about women beaten for existing. I did not ask him to kill only Master Lavini. I asked him to open a door, to loosen the bars on the cage of the dead. to let every enslaved spirit who had died under Lavigne's rule, under all their rules, step through and be witness, and if they willed it, be judgment. The moment I lit the wick, the flame did not behave like a normal flame. It rose tall and thin, white at its heart, with a ring of every color around it, and the air grew so cold that my breath fogged the darkness, though outside the night was still hot enough to make sweat bead on skin. I felt something tear inside me, slowly, like fabric pulled apart fiber by fiber. My joints ached, my heart stumbled, my vision blurred at the edges. The spirits were taking their price, and they were not gentle, but I did not flinch. I watched the candle burn. 7 hours. I did not move, did not sleep. The flame danced and twisted, and at times seemed to split into shapes, hands, faces, doorways, but I did not let my eyes fully focus, because some things are not meant to be seen by the living. When at last the wick sputtered and the flame went out, a line of thin smoke spiraled upward and vanished as if devoured by something waiting above. The silence that followed was deeper than any I had ever heard. I knew without doubt that the bargain had been struck. Master Lavigne's hours were counted, and the sum was small. Late that night, in the big house up the road, Lavigne's guards stood at his door, as they had every night for weeks, backs against the wood, hands on their guns, palms sweating despite the charms and crosses pinned to their clothes. Inside, Lavigne paced his room, amulets clinking on his chest, holy water sprinkled on every corner, so many times the wood warped with damp. He had refused food cooked by anyone else and eaten only what he watched being prepared. He slept barely at all. He had tried priests and fraudulent voodoo men and bottles of liquor and long lectures about rationality, but the truth coiled quietly in his gut. Something was coming for him that no musket, no whip, no prayer he believed in could stop. The guards heard nothing that night, no struggle, no shout, no crash of furniture, no creak of footsteps. The hallway remained still, but when dawn finally smeared a sickly light across the horizon and they unlocked his door, they found Lavigne dead on the floor, his body unmarked, his face twisted into an expression of horror, so profound it was, as if he had stared into the gaping mouth of every sin he had ever committed. His hands clutched his chest, fingers digging into his own flesh, and his eyes were open wide, glassy, staring at something no one else could see, something that had come through a door only Papa Legba could open. The doctor was summoned. He said heart failure, sudden and inexplicable. The slaves said the spirits had finally collected their due. I stayed in my cabin, hands folded, listening to the commotion in the distance. When word came down, carried in whispers that trembled with fear and awe, I closed my eyes and thought of Baptiste. For a moment, my grief rose up so painfully that I nearly broke, because no number of dead masters could bring him back. No fire could rewind time. But then I thought of what would happen next, not the burial, not the white tears, but the chaos, the gap in power, the crack in the great monstrous wall that had trapped us all. Because the seventh candle had not been made only for Lavigne, it had been made for the parish, for what would follow his fall. That same night, small fires bloomed across the 7 plantations. They did not start in the big houses. They were not meant to destroy or punish in the way the white folks would understand. Instead, they sparked in barns and storage sheds, in sugar mills and slave quarters, in places where the sight of flame would send overseers and guards running, shouting orders, scattering their attention like startled birds. Most of those fires had nothing to do with spirits. They were lit by hands that had been planning for months, by men and women who had listened to conductors from the Underground Railroad describe routes and timings, by people who knew that fear was now the whip driving their masters, and that fear could be turned into cover. To the white folks, though, every flicker of flame as well have been a ghost. They saw patterns where there were only plans. They saw curses where there were carefully whispered strategies. They saw, in every stray ember, the hand of the same voodoo that had just killed 7 of their own. Panic spread faster than fire. Overseers tried to organize buckets and lines of water, but each new shout about flames in a distant building pulled them away. Guards ran in circles, shooting into the night at shadows that held nothing but insects and wind. Dogs howled and pulled at their leashes, confused by the competing sense of smoke and fear. And in the middle of that chaos, when the sky glowed faintly with scattered embers and the carefully maintained order of the plantations frayed into noise, 400 enslaved people slipped into the darkness. They did not run in one great screaming crowd. They moved in groups of 20 or 30, led by those who had memorized paths through swamps and bayous, those who had listened to conductors explain how to move unseen, when to use the river and when to avoid it, how to follow stars and morse and the shape of trees. Some carried bags filled with dried food and water gourds buried weeks earlier beneath roots and rocks. Some carried tools, knives and hatchets that would serve them in the wild. Mothers carried sleeping children wrapped close to their chests. Fathers walked at the edges of groups, eyes sharp, ready to throw themselves between their families and whatever waited beyond the tree line. Old men and women with aching joints moved slower but refused to be left behind. The swamp welcomed them. The darkness covered them. They vanished into the tangle of cypress and mud, as if the land had been waiting all along to take them back. A few overseers tried to organize pursuit, but many refused to go beyond the glow of the last fires. They had spent months watching masters die in strange and unexplainable ways, listening to rumors of curses and candles and spirits. Now, with Lavini dead in a locked room and flames blooming without obvious cause, their courage crumbled. Some muttered that the swamp was full of ghosts. Others clutched crosses or charms, sweating and pale, insisting that stepping into the dark would mean being dragged down by invisible hands. The ones who did attempt pursuit found only silence, only the creak of branches and the ripple of unseen creatures in the water. The trails left by 400 people had been cleverly fragmented, split off, covered, redirected. The swamp, which had always devoured slave bodies without anyone caring, devoured footprints instead. By dawn, more than 400 enslaved souls were gone, and not even the dogs could find them. The plantations woke to a new reality. 7 masters dead in 7 months. Hundreds of slaves vanished. Sheds and mills charred. The illusion of invincible order shattered like glass. White folks whispered that voodoo had burned their world down. Some said the devil had walked the parish. Others said God himself had turned his face away. What none of them ever realized was that those fires, those escapes, were not just the work of unseen spirits, but of human hands and human minds that had refused to stay broken. I did not join the escape. My body was too tired, my bones too full of the price I had already paid. Since the 7th candle, every step felt heavier. My hair had turned more grey in a week than in the previous 5 years. My joints swelled. A tremor shook my hands when I tried to grip the candle molds. The lower had taken what they were owed and left their marks upon me. But that was not the only reason I stayed. Someone had to remain, to anchor the story, to pass on what had been done and why, to keep the old ways alive not as legend, but as living practice. And there were still souls here who could not yet leave. The sick, the very old, those with children too frail to travel, those whose fear was still stronger than their hope. They came to my door in the weeks after the escape, leaving small offerings: cornbread, tobacco, dried meat, flowers stolen from the edges of the big house gardens. They did not ask if I had done it. They did not need to. They simply looked at me with a mixture of gratitude and awe and something like fear. The way people look at storms after they pass, grateful for the rain, shaken by the thunder. The white authorities investigated if their flailing could be called that. They questioned slaves, whipped some for answers they did not have or refused to give, sent riders along the river and into the woods, and wrote letters to officials in other parishes demanding assistance. They hired men to look for patterns, for a leader, for a mastermind, but they never looked at me. To them I was just an aging slave woman who made candles, someone too ordinary to have cooled down the deaths of 7 masters, too unimportant to have unraveled the structure of their power. They searched for signs of poison and knives. For conspiracies they understood guns, maps, secret meetings in barns. They found nothing. The candles had burned down to waxy ghosts weeks earlier. The rituals I performed left no footprints. The spirits had done their work and receded into the spaces between worlds where no law could follow. The 7 plantations never fully recovered. Without their lords, without the full force of their enslaved labor, they struggled. Some were sold in pieces to men who would never fully tame them again. Others rotted slowly, fields going to seed, buildings collapsing in on themselves. The parish itself shifted, its dominance fractured, its certainty gone. Fear remained, yes, but it was no longer one-sided. The masters who were left in neighboring areas walked more carefully, glancing with suspicion at every flicker of candlelight in the quarters, at every whispered prayer they heard, but could not interpret. They had learned, perhaps for the first time, that the people they kept in chains were not empty vessels. We had gods of our own. We had power of our own. We had patience. And we had memory. 10 years later, war came, rolling across the South like a storm with many heads. Cannons roared. Sons of slave owners marched and died. Laws that had held 4 generations cracked under the weight of bullets and blood. I watched the Civil War tear at the fabric of the Confederacy from the edges of a world I had already set on fire in my own way. When news finally reached us that slavery had been abolished, when men rode dusty into the parish shouting that we were free, I stepped out into the light with the other former slaves and watched them walk away from the fields with shoulders squared in a way I had never seen. They were laughing and crying at the same time, faces tilted toward the sky as if they were seeing it for the first time, without a hand pressing their chin downward. It did not erase what had been done. Freedom came with its own hunger and confusion, its own brutal lessons. But as I watched, I knew that the night of the 7th candle had been a thread in that larger tapestry, one act of resistance among many, a crack in the dam that had finally burst. I lived until 1869. In the 15 years between the year of the candles and my death, the debt I had agreed to pay continued to collect. My hair turned fully white, though I was only in my 30s. My back curved forward, my hands knotted with aches. By the time I was 50, I looked like a woman of 70. Nightmares visited me often. I saw the 7 masters die over and over, their faces twisted, their eyes wide, their bodies broken by forces they could not name. Sometimes I woke with my heart pounding, my throat raw from screams I could not remember starting. Sometimes I saw Bautiste in those dreams. Sometimes he smiled at me with the same soft joy he had carried all his life. Sometimes he looked at me with a sadness that pierced deeper than any whip. Was it worth it, Mama? His eyes seemed to ask, and each time, even with my soul heavy from the 7 deaths I had helped cause, even with my body bearing the marks of the bargain, I answered, silently but firmly, yes, because each of those men had carved suffering into the flesh of others without remorse, because their deaths had freed hundreds, because their fall had shaken the lie that they were untouchable, because justice, when it finally comes, is never clean. I bought a small house after emancipation with the little money I earned from candle making and healing work. It was nothing grand, a single-story structure with weathered boards and a roof that creaked when the rain came, but it was mine. No one could drag me from it with a word. No one could sell it out from under me. I lined the shelves with jars of herbs, bottles of oils, bundles of dried plants hanging from the rafters like quiet guardians. People came to my door not as property, but as neighbors, asking for remedies, for charms, for prayers. Some came just to talk, to sit in the presence of an old woman who had once, they whispered, killed 7 masters with 7 candles. I never confirmed it, never denied it. I did not need to. The truth had already woven itself into the parish's bones. Before I died, I chose 3 young women who carried in them the same quiet strength my grandmother had once seen in me. I taught them the names of the lower, the herbs that heal and the roots that harm, the difference between justice and vengeance, and the course tangled in both. I told them the story of Bautiste and the 7 candles, of the masters and their deaths, of the escape and the night the fires burned across the parish. I did not tell them my story to make them follow it. I told it, so they would understand that power is never free, that every flame leaves ash, that every curse leaves a mark not only on its target, but on the one who calls it. I told them to heal more than they harmed, to protect more than they punished, to remember that not every wound can or should be answered with blood. When I finally felt my body preparing to leave this world in 1869, I lay in my small house, surrounded by those who loved me. They sang hymns and whispered prayers in French and Creole. A priest came and spoke Catholic words over me. My students traced Vaves in invisible gestures. Both worlds met over my body, the one my captors had tried to force on me, and the one my ancestors had carried across oceans inside their bones. I felt the lower gather, not in anger this time, but in acknowledgement. Baron Samedi waiting at the edge of the grave, Papa Legba at the crossroads, ready to open the last door. I thought of Baptiste and felt, for the first time in years, a kind of lightness bloom in my chest. When they buried me, they marked my grave with more care than any slave cemetery had ever seen. People came, leaving offerings, rum, cigars, small candles. They asked for justice, for protection, for courage. I could no longer answer, not directly. My part was done, but the story of what had happened in 1854 lived on. A quiet fire passed from mouth to mouth. They called it voodoo. They called it witchcraft. They called it a curse. But beneath all their names was a simpler truth. It was a mother's grief sharpened into a weapon, a woman's knowledge of wax and wick and spirits turned against those who had believed her powerless. And while my specific story was mine alone, bound to St. John the Baptist parish and the 7 plantations that once towered there like monuments to cruelty, it was also a reflection of something larger, of the way voodoo and other African-rooted faiths had survived the Middle Passage, stitched themselves into the soil of Louisiana, and become both shield and sword for the enslaved. The white masters had feared what they did not understand, whispering about curses and dark rituals, imagining powers that might rise against them in the night. Sometimes those fears were superstition, sometimes they were warnings. In the long years of slavery, there were many like me, women and men, who used the old ways not to kill, but to heal, to protect, to resist in ways that left no scars for history to find. There were practitioners who gave courage to runaways, who used herbs to ease pain when no doctor would help, who left small tokens in masters' paths to make them uneasy enough to hesitate. There were escapes that succeeded because chaos had been carefully sown beforehand, like seeds in prepared soil. There were whispers that traveled farther than chains. The Underground Railroad in Louisiana was never as organized as it was in border states closer to free soil, but it existed, woven into river routes and swamp paths, carried encoded songs and stories. And even when the stories were later called legend or myth, those who had heard them knew there was truth in the way fear moves, in the way belief shapes reality, in the way a candle burning in the right hands can be more dangerous than a gun. Long after my bones turned to dust, people would still tell the story of the candlemaker who killed 7 masters and freed 400 souls. They would argue about which parts were real, which parts were embellished, which parts belonged to the world of spirits, and which to the world of men. But the exact details mattered less than the legacy it carried, the reminder that resistance does not always look like armies and flags. Sometimes it looks like a woman in a small cabin, holding a lock of her dead child's hair in one hand and a lit match in the other, whispering the names of gods who refused to die, and choosing, in a world that denied her every choice, to strike back after my death, or what the world believed was my death. The parish settled into a quiet, so peculiar it felt as if the land itself were holding its breath, as if every cypress tree and stretch of muddy river remembered what had happened in 1854 and understood that silence was both a blessing and a warning. But death, as I came to understand, is not an ending so much as a shifting of weight, a rearranging of spirit, a passage through a door Papa Legba opens only when the soul is ready. The moment my last breath left my body in that small house with uneven floors and herbs hanging from its rafters, I felt myself step forward into a world shaped not of soil and air, but of memory and spirit. A place woven from whispers and the lingering heat of countless candles, lit by hands like mine across centuries. Baron Samedi greeted me first, lounging atop a gravestone carved from the bones of forgotten men, his grin wide and sharp beneath his top hat. "You took your time, Cher," he said, balancing a cigar between his teeth. "I was beginning to think you'd wear that mortal body into dust before letting it rest." I told him I had promised to teach 3 young women everything I knew, and that promises even the small ones made between breaths carry weight. He nodded, pleased, and gestured for me to join him. Behind him the realm of the dead stretched out, not empty or cold as some feared, but thick with sound, songs humming through the air like waves, voices braided with stories, children laughing in the distance, ancestors gathered around fire pits that glowed without burning. And then I heard him Baptiste, not as the broken child left at my feet, but as the boy he was meant to be, whole, warm, his laughter bright, his eyes curious. He ran toward me, and when his arms closed around my waist, a century of pain fell away from my spirit like cracked wax dropping from a candle. I held him, and for the first time in 15 years, the world felt soft again. But death did not erase responsibility, and the lower made that clear. After I had lingered in that embrace long enough for my heart to memorize it, Papa Legba approached with a staff in his hand and crossroads etched into his smile. "You called for justice," he said, and justice answered. "But balance is not a one-time ritual. Balance is a river always shifting, always needing tending." I asked him what that meant for someone like me, someone who had already paid with blood, bone, age, nightmares, and years stolen from her body. He tapped his staff onto the ground, and the earth rippled like water, revealing the living world above. A parish changed on the surface, but still cracked underneath, in ways that echoed louder in the spirit realm than in the land of the breathing. I saw the plantations of St. John the Baptist Parish, saw the ruins of the sugar mill where Beaumont had met his fate, saw the remnants of the fields where children once worked until the bones in their feet bent beneath them. I saw Lavigne's old house, now sold to a man from New York who walked its halls without understanding that the walls remembered every scream. I saw descendants of the enslaved walking free, heads high, their feet unshackled, their eyes bright with inherited resilience. But I also saw the weight still carried in their shoulders, the residue of generations who had bent their backs against the sun because they had no other choice. "Their road is not yet free of stones," Legba said. "Freedom came, yes, but wounds can become ghosts too, ghosts that haunt generations." He told me that spirits like mine, those who had crossed with purpose, had the duty to watch, to guide, to whisper strength into the bones of the living the same way ancestors had whispered to us. "The work he began with 7 candles," he said, "was not for one night. It was for a line of futures." I looked then to the women I had taught Celeste, strong and steady, with hands that could weave protective charms into the hems of dresses. Josephine, younger but fierce, her voice able to carry prayers sharp enough to cut through lies. And Mariel, quiet, observant, with a mind that remembered everything and a heart tender enough to heal wounds others could not see. After my passing, the 3 of them continued the practice. They blended old ways with new needs, healing the sick, warding off harm, helping fugitives of the war, mending the broken places torn apart by soldiers and loss. Word of them spread. Some called them midwives, some called them witches, some called them mombos, as they called my grandmother. And though they rarely said my name aloud, I felt them call to me each time they knelt before their altars, each time they lit a candle with intention in their breath. Spirit work listens, spirit work echoes, but the living world shifted in ways even the lower could not fully predict. The Civil War left scars deep as riverbeds. Reconstruction built towers only to tear them down again. White men who had once ruled plantations clutched their fading power even as it slipped through their fingers like mud. Black men voted for the first time and then were beaten back by laws dipped in honey but edged in blade. Terror wore many masks, hoods, badges, titles, smiles, and with each shift, I found myself drawn closer to the border between worlds. Spirits do not age, but they grow heavier with what they witness. I walked alongside soldiers who died crying for mothers who never knew where their sons fell. I stood beside children whose small graves would never be marked because poverty swallows names. I visited former slaves who built new lives with hands still shaking from old traumas. Some nights I saw echoes of Beaumont, Devo, Martian shadows of men whose cruelty persisted in bloodlines even when their faces did not. Justice, I learned, is not a single event, but a constant negotiation between what was done and what remains possible. About 20 years after my death, one of my students, Mariel, faced a threat that called me back with an urgency sharp enough to pierce even the veil. A man named Reddick Beaumont had purchased Lavigne's old property. He fancied himself enlightened, a man who believed he could reshape the South into his own vision. A vision that included exploiting the newly freed in ways not unlike the past, though he hid it behind contracts and wages that were never enough, behind debts manufactured to bind people to land they never owned. Mariel confronted him one night, warning him to treat his workers with dignity. He laughed. He spat at her feet. He called her words superstition, her warnings nonsense. And then he raised his hand to strike her. That was when the wind shifted. Spirits feel violence before it happens, a kind of tremor in the dark. I stepped through the veil without fully understanding how or why I could, only that I was needed. The candle on Mariel's altar flared to life, though she had not lit it, and behind her I rose not in flesh, but in shadow and memory, the shape I carried when the lower stood with me. Reddick froze, his hand still suspended mid-strike. He looked at me, but he did not recognize my face. Only the expression, the same silent, steady sorrow mixed with rage that Thornton had seen the morning he threw Bautiste at my feet. "You don't exist," he whispered. "You're just a story they tell to scare white men." I stepped forward, though my footsteps made no sound, and the room grew colder, and the candle flame stretched tall as though pulled upward by invisible hands. "Stories," I told him without speaking, "are doors, and doors open." He stumbled backward, knocking over a chair, and fled the room. He lasted a year before his greed led him into a swamp during a storm, where the mud swallowed him in 3 breaths. The land remembers. The land collects its dues. Mariel buried the candle remnants that night and strengthened her wards. She told no one what she had seen, but she knew. To generations later, in the early 1900s, I watched from the spirit world as the last remnants of the 7 plantations were sold off, carved into smaller parcels. Some of the sugar mills rusted into skeletons. Some of the big houses collapsed under storms or termites. Others became museums, where tourists walked through rooms that once held chains, without understanding they were stepping into graves. But the stories remained. Descendants of those who had escaped in 1854 returned sometimes, standing on land that had once owned them. They placed small candles near the river banks. They whispered thanks to ancestors. Some brought children who listened with wide eyes as they were told about a woman who made candles powerful enough to tear down 7 men. The white folks had their own version stories twisted by guilt and fear. They said I was a witch who consorted with devils. They said I poisoned the masters. They said I summoned hurricanes and plagues. They said my soul was damned. The louder they repeated those stories, the clearer it became which parts haunted them. In the 1920s, a young black schoolteacher from New Orleans named Althea began collecting oral histories from former slaves. She arrived in St. John the Baptist parish with notebooks and questions, determined to preserve what white historians ignored. When she asked elders about the 7 plantations, about Lavigne and Beaumont and Thornton, they spoke cautiously at first, but when she asked about the candles, their eyes shifted. Some whispered, some refused, but a few, the oldest, leaned forward and spoke my name, Eck. They told her about Bautiste, about the candles, about the escapes, about the lower, about the night the parish seemed to burn from within. She wrote everything down. She wept while writing. She carried those notebooks across Louisiana, reading from them in churches and community halls, teaching children that their ancestors had fought in ways not recorded in textbooks. Her work sparked something, a revival of pride, of memory, of the knowledge that resistance wears many faces. She visited my grave once, laying a red candle at its base. She said, "I don't know if you can hear me, Miss Eck, but I want you to know that your story saves someone tonight." I heard her. Spirits always hear truth. By the 1950s, the civil rights movement began to roar. Young people marched, sang, faced bullets, dogs, and fire hoses. And sometimes, late at night before a march, a group of them would gather around candles, lit from a single flame passed hand to hand. They didn't know why the ritual felt right. They didn't know the origin of the gesture. They only knew that candles meant courage, meant calling on something older than fear. I stood among them many nights, unseen but present, the way my grandmother had stood beside me. When one young man, no older than Baptiste, collapsed from exhaustion and doubt, I whispered strength into his bones. When a girl barely 16 prayed to survive the next day's march, I wrapped her spirit in the same cloak of protection had used for Mariel. When victory finally came slow, painful, bittersweet, I felt the shift ripple across the country, a bell tolling in a distant tower. Time moved on. Generations layered themselves atop one another, like wax poured into a mold. The 1970s brought scholars studying voodoo with curiosity other than contempt. The 1990s brought tourists eager to consume the aesthetics without honoring the faith. The 2000s brought documentaries, some respectful, some foolish. They called voodoo magic. They called it superstition. They called it danger. Few called it what it truly was, survival. But always, candles remained. In 2010, a hurricane swept through Louisiana with such force that entire neighborhoods drowned. Houses splintered, roofs tore away, beloved photographs floated into the Gulf. People cried to whatever God they believed in, and amid that devastation, a woman named Elise, great-great-granddaughter of Celeste, lit a candle in the ruins of her home. She prayed not for herself, but for her community. I stood beside her. She felt me, though she did not see me. Her candle flickered in the wind, but did not go out. That night volunteers arrived unexpectedly, bringing supplies, boats, and first aid. Her prayer had opened a door, and the spirits had walked through it. Over time I noticed something changing. The living began to forget the details of my story, but not its essence. They passed down lessons instead of names. That justice requires courage. That mothers carry power deeper than flesh. That the dead are not gone. That candles can be weapons when lit with intention. My name faded in some mouths, mispronounced in others, but echoed true in the circles of those who kept the old ways alive. In the 2020s, a young woman researching Louisiana folklore published a book collecting stories about forgotten acts of resistance. One chapter bore the title, "The Seven Flames of St. John the Baptist Parish." She described me not as a witch or a monster, but as a mother who chose to stand when the world expected her to kneel. She framed the candles not as curses, but as instruments of retribution shaped by grief, faith, and ancestral power. She wrote, "Some say she never died. Some say her spirit still walks the parish at night, watching over those who burn candles with purpose." And she was right, because even now, long after my bones returned to the dirt and my name became a story told around fires and in whispers, I still walk, not always in form, not always in voice, but in flame, in courage, in grief that becomes strength. I walk beside mothers who bury children taken by violence. I walk beside workers exploited by new masters with different names, but the same hunger for control. I walk beside the lonely, the lost, the desperate, the wounded. When someone lights a candle with trembling hands and whispers a plea into the smoke, I hear them. I sit with them. I carry their words to the lower. And sometimes, when justice refuses to come through mortal hands, I help open a door the way Papa Legba once opened it for me. Because the world has changed but not changed enough. Because oppression learns to wear new clothes. Because people still bleed. Because grief still sharpens itself into resolve. Because even in the brightest cities, even in the most modern rooms, darkness still creeps and danger still breathes. and the powerful still feast on the powerless unless someone stands between them. I am not flesh anymore. I am not the woman who once dipped wicks and melted wax and buried her child beneath a sky heavy with sorrow. I am the echo of that woman. I am the shadow of her grief. I am the flame of her vengeance. And I am not alone. Every soul who escaped that night in 1854 walked into a future that made more futures. Their descendants live in cities, in small towns, in countries my grandmother never imagined, each carrying a thread of the story, even if they do not know it. Each carrying the strength of ancestors who chose to run. Each carrying the memory of candles burning in the dark, guiding them forward. They think their ambition comes from themselves. They think their resilience belongs only to their bodies. They do not realize an old woman with white hair and aching bones once whispered strength into the backbone of their lineage. They do not realize that when they refuse to bow, when they refuse to break, when they rise again and again against systems built to crush them, they are living proof that the work of one grieving mother still ripples outward centuries later. In the far future, farther than any living soul now can conceive, people will still tell the story of the 7 candles, though the details may twist and shift. They will say a woman burned down the south with her grief. They will say the lower road through Louisiana on a night with no moon. They will say 400 souls vanished into the swamp and emerged into freedom because a mother's sorrow tore open the sky. They will say a candlemaker crossed into death and returned as something more. And they will be right, each in their way. Because stories, like candles, burn differently depending on who lights them, but they all begin with a spark, small and trembling, until someone breathes purpose into it. My purpose began the day they brought Baptist's body back to me. It continues still. It will continue long that every plantation has crumbled, long after my name is spoken only in guesses, long after the world has forgotten the shape of my face. As long as injustice exists, as long as grief needs a voice, as long as candles burn in the dark, I will walk, I will watch, I will answer. I am Ek, daughter of Marie, mother of Baptist, servant of the lower, keeper of the 7 flames. And my story is not finished, not yet, not ever. In the quiet that comes after centuries, when the loudest voices of history have faded into dust and only the deeper echoes remain, I have learned to listen differently, not just to the cries of the wounded or the sharp pleas for justice, but to the softer sounds that carry just as much truth. The lullaby hummed by a tired mother in a cramped apartment in a city far from Louisiana. The sigh of a man staring at a contract he knows was written to keep him small. The prayer whispered by a girl standing in front of a school that does not want her there. The rustle of hands striking matches in the dark to light candles on altars improvised from kitchen tables and knit stands and windowsills. These are the sounds of the world my 7 candles helped to shape. Though no one living could trace the line directly from my small cabin in St. John the Baptist Parish, 1854, to the busy streets and glowing screens of their time, yet I can trace it as easily as I once traced Vavis in cornmeal on packed dirt floors, my spirit following the threads that connect grief to action, fear to courage, memory to resistance. I see Baptist's lineage spread outward like ripples from a stone dropped in deep water. A boy who died at 9 leaves no children, people say, but people are wrong. Children like him do not vanish from the story. They change its direction. The women who escaped because of the fear my candles sowed carried his name in songs they sang over their babies. The men who ran that night with the swamp water up to their knees hardened their resolve at the memory of a small boy smiling at a girl and paying with his life. They told that story too many times for it to vanish. They passed it to their children and their children's children, and though the details blurred and shifted with each telling, the core remained. A child's death had become a reckoning. In one version, they say Baptist's spirit walked beside the fugitives in the swamp, guiding their steps around hidden roots and sinkholes. In another, they say he climbed a cypress tree and turned into a star that watched them as they moved north. In another, they say he grew into a man in the afterlife and guarded river crossings, so slave catchers drowned whenever they tried to follow. All of these are wrong and all of them are true, because stories are not about facts, They are about meaning, and the meaning was always this: our dead are not idle. They push, they pull, they steer. I watch his influence live on in a woman born in Chicago in 1941, who marches in 1963 with sore feet and a hoarse throat, her mind full of sermons about freedom and scripture, about justice and a story her grandmother told her about a boy down in Louisiana who never got to grow old because he looked the wrong way at the wrong person. She doesn't remember his name when she tells her own children about courage, only that he was just a child and that they killed him for nothing, and that somebody's mama down there made sure they paid. Her daughter grows up with that story nestled beside news headlines about lynchings, and one night, in a cramped apartment smelling of fried onions and worrying, she lights a candle before her son leaves for a protest and whispers, "Let the spirits that protected those people in the old days walk with you." She does not say my name. She does not need to. There is a young man in 1982 who works nights at a factory and days at a community college, who feels the weight of invisible chains every time a supervisor calls him boy or a bank denies him a loan with a smile. His grandmother, dying, takes his hand and tells him he comes from strong people, the kind who burn their way out of hell, if they had to. She mentions St. John the Baptist Parish, Louisiana. She mentions a woman who made candles and turned nastas into corpses. He laughs at first, because it sounds unreal, but the image sticks in his mind, a woman in a small room lighting a candle and changing everything. Years later, when his daughter struggles against a school system that tracks her away from her dreams, he tells her that story not as a historical fact, but as a metaphor. If you can't break the door down, find another way, baby. Light your own kind of candle. She becomes a lawyer who fights the sort of contracts Reddick Beaumont once used, the sort of laws Lavini would have written if he had lived to see such things. She wins cases that free people from predatory debts. She never connects her work to the glow of seven flames in 1854, but I do. There is a girl in 2003 who visits Louisiana on a school trip. They take her to plantations, dressed up as tourist sites. She walks through big houses, where guides talk about architecture and party gowns and gracious living. Her teacher, uncomfortable but complicit, says little. The girl feels something wrong under her skin, like splinters. No one mentions the slave quarters until near the end, as an afterthought. No one mentions the slave cemetery at all. She wanders away from the group, her feet drawn down a narrow path lined with weeds, and finds a patch of ground that feels heavy. There is no marker, no cross, no stone, but the air feels familiar to me, thick with whispers and uncried tears. She stands there, shivering in summer heat, and whispers, "I don't know your names, but I see you." Wind brushes her cheek like the back of a ghostly hand. When she returns home, she cannot stop thinking about that unmarked earth. She grows into a woman who studies history, who writes books that refuse to sand the edges off the past. In one of her chapters, she tells the story of the seven candles not because she finds documentation in archives or records in dusty ledgers, but because she finds evidence in the stories passed down, in the trembling pride of elders' voices, in the way the land itself seems to pulse when she stands in St. John the Baptist Parish. Whether or not every detail is literally true, she writes, it is emotionally true, spiritually true, historically true. It reflects a reality we know from other evidence, that enslaved people resisted, both openly and in ways that left few fingerprints. I stand behind her as she types, my hand resting lightly on her shoulder, and for a moment, her fingers pause on the keys. She murmurs, "Thank you, whoever you were." I answer, though she cannot hear it with her ears, "You're welcome. Keep going." There are many like her, story keepers, memory weavers, people who feel that something crucial lives in the spaces between official narratives. There are also those who cheapen what we are, turning voodoo into a costume for parties, a punchline in movies, a scare tactic in horror shows. They drape plastic bones and cartoon skulls over fake altars and call it homage, not realizing how many real bones lie in unmarked graves beneath their festivals. I used to rage at this, my spirit bristling at every trivialization, every lazy caricature, but the lower are older than insult. And they taught me something. Faith does not lose its power because it is misunderstood. It loses its power only if those who know it forget. And we have not forgotten. In a small house in New Orleans, a young Mambo named Lisette lights a candle at her altar. She calls on Papa Legba, on Azuli, on Ogun, and, once in a while, when she feels the weight of her community pressing hard against her thin shoulders, she calls on the old mothers who fought in ways we'll never fully know. In those moments, I step forward. I stand with her. I help steady her hands when she anoints a visitor with oil. I help sharpen her instincts when she advises someone on whether to stay in a job that eats their spirit or leave into uncertainty. She sometimes has dreams of a woman with white hair tied back in a scarf, hands stained with wax, eyes tired but unbroken. She sketches at fate in her journal without knowing who it is. When people ask her where her strength comes from, she laughs and says, "From my people, baby. From all the ones behind me." She is right. She's one of the futures I saw when Papa Legba showed me the line of my work rippling outward. Another future walks in a protest in 2020. A mask over her face, a cardboard sign in her hand, her throat raw from chanting, her heart beating not just for herself, but for those whose last words were recorded on shaky phone cameras. Before she left home that day, her grandfather pressed a small candle into her hand and said, "This belonged to your great-grandmother. She always lit one when times were hard. Take it." Might not mean anything, might mean everything. She tucked it in her pocket, fingers tracing the ridges in the wax when fear tried to climb her spine as police in riot gear advanced. She whispered, "If there's anyone out there, ancestors, saints, whoever, watch me. Help me." I heard her. I walked with her. The tear gas burned. The night was violent, but she returned home alive, shaken yet determined. She lit the candle that night and watched the flame stretch and steady, and somewhere deep in the marrow of her bones, she felt less alone. This is what my story has become. Not a single narrative fixed in time, but a lantern carried by many hands. Some know my name. Most do not. It does not matter. What matters is that they know someone like me existed, that someone from their past refused to accept a world where their children's lives were worth less than a white man's temper. That knowledge works on them quietly, even when they do not think of it consciously. It lifts their chin. It straightens their back. It gives them a little more courage than they thought they had. In the realm of spirits, time does not move in a straight line the way the living experience it. I can stand at Baptist's grave in 1854, at a church in 1963, at a march in 2020, and at a kitchen table in 2090 all at once, feeling the same current of longing and anger and hope flowing through different bodies. I can see a boy in the future sitting in a classroom mid-year from glass and screens, listening to a lesson about the era of slavery delivered in dry academic tones that cannot capture the heat of cane fields or the sting of whips. He feels bored, disconnected, until his teacher plays an audio recording of an old woman decades dead. Her voice trembling, she recounts the story of the woman with the candles down in St. John the Baptist parish. The boy sits up. Something in that story grabs him. Later, at home, he looks it up. He finds arguments online about whether my story ever really happened. Some say yes, some say no, some say it doesn't matter. He closes his screen and whispers before bed, "If you were real, if you can hear me, I want to be brave too." I hear him. Brave for what, I wonder? For something I may never witness, for a fight I cannot yet see. But I know this, when his time comes to stand at his own crossroads, when he has to choose between safety and principle, between silence and truth, I will be there. So will Marie, so will Baptiste, so will Celeste and Joseph and Mariel and Althea and Lisette and all the others who carried our story forward. We will stand just behind his shoulder, invisible but solid, whispering, "Remember us. Remember what we did with nothing but our hands, our faith, and our pain. You have more than we did. Use it." If I could speak plainly to the living all at once, without veils or mediums or stories, I would say this: do not romanticize what we endured. Do not polish the chains into metaphors so smooth they no longer cut. Do not turn plantations into pretty backdrops without speaking of the screams that once filled their halls. Do not make heroes of those who owned bodies as if they were furniture. Remember the 7 masters of St. John the Baptist Parish as men of their time, but as men who chose, again and again, to build comfort on the backs of suffering. Understand that their deaths were not tragedies equal to the deaths they caused. They were small weights on a scale that had been tipped too far for too long. And if you light candles for us, do not do it only in sorrow. Light them in power. Light them as promises. Let each flame mean, I will not repeat the cruelties you suffered. I will not look away from the cruelties that still exist. I will not pretend the past is gone, because the laws have changed. Let each wick you set afire be a reminder that someone before you risked everything to make the world you now stand in a little less cruel. If you practice the old ways, honor the lower as they deserve, neither feared as demons nor trivialized as party decorations, but respected as complex, ancient beings who walked with us through horrors and carried us into survival. If you practice another faith, do not think that shuts us out. Spirits do not care what names you give the divine. They care that you act with integrity. They care that you protect those who cannot protect themselves. They care that you do not turn away from injustice because it is uncomfortable to look at. I was a woman once, flesh and bone and trembling hands, standing in a cabin with 7 candles and the heart cracked open by grief. I was a mother who buried her child in dirt that did not want his body, but took it anyway. I was a slave who used the only tools available: wax, flame, prayer, and rage to carve a small measure of justice out of a land built on injustice. I suffered for it. I paid. I do not regret it. My story is my own, but it is also yours if you choose it. Not because you must call spirits or light cursed candles, but because you, too, stand in a world where power often belongs to the wrong hands, where children still die for reasons that should never exist, where fear still shapes laws and lives. You do not have to do what I did. You only have to refuse to be the person who watches a boy like Bottis die and calls it just the way things are. You only have to refuse to be the master, to refuse to be the bystander, to choose, in whatever ways are open to you, to be the flame. In the end, that is what I became, not the monster some claimed, not the saint others tried to make me, but a flame, dangerous when wielded in hatred, life-saving when used with care, always hungry for truth. I burned down 7 men who believed themselves untouchable. I helped 400 souls walk into a new life. I paid with my years, my ease, my sleep. And still, if I were given the choice again, standing on that Tuesday morning with Baptist's broken body at my feet, with Thornton's cold words still in the air, with the swamp swallowing the echoes of my scream, I would choose the flame again, because some lessons must be burned into the world to be remembered. As long as there are candles in dark rooms, as long as there are mothers who refuse to let their children's deaths be buried in silence, as long as there are people willing to risk their own comfort for the freedom of others, my work continues. My 7 candles are long gone, their wax melted into the soil of St. John the Baptist Parish, their smoke dissolved into the sky, but their light did not die. It lives in you, and whenever you stand at your own crossroads, trembling and uncertain, holding a match in one hand and your fear in the other, know this: somewhere just beyond the edge of what you can see, I am there, watching, waiting, ready to